There is a photograph taken in 1903 of the entire Roosevelt family on the porch of Sagamore Hill. Theodore is in the center, grinning. The children are mid-laugh, mid-motion, and Edith is seated slightly to one side, composed, watching. Not stiff, not cold, just contained. She ran the White House with the precision of a general. She managed a president, 6 children, a staff, and a nation's expectations, without ever once letting anyone see her stumble, the one who never made a mistake. But behind that composure was a story almost no one knew, one that didn't end when she left the White House. It kept going, through wars and losses and grief she bore so quietly that the people around her sometimes forgot she was carrying it at all. This is the story of Edith Roosevelt. Segment 8. A childhood spent hiding. To understand Edith Roosevelt, you have to start not with the White House, but with a brownstone on Union Square in New York City in the 1860s. She was born Edith Kermit Carow on August 6, 1861, in Norwich, Connecticut, the first of 2 daughters born to Charles Carow and Gertrude Elizabeth Tyler. On paper, the family had every advantage. The Carows were connected to a prosperous New York shipping business. There was money, social standing, and a comfortable address in one of Manhattan's finer neighborhoods. But inside that house, it was a different world entirely. Her father, Charles Carow, was a chronic gambler, a failing businessman, and an alcoholic. Not the genteel, one glass too many kind of drinker that polite society sometimes winked at, but the kind whose habits quietly dismantled everything around him. His business decisions grew reckless. The money began to drain, and the family that had once been comfortably wealthy found itself, within a few years, moving from relative to relative, depending on the charity of others just to keep a roof overhead. Her mother, Gertrude, retreated inward. She became what people in those days called a hypochondriac, someone so preoccupied with her own illnesses, real or imagined, that she had little capacity left to be present for her daughters. The result was that Edith, from a very young age, was essentially on her own emotionally. She dealt with it the way many quiet, intelligent children do. She disappeared into books. She read everything she could find. She became, by the time she was a teenager, one of the most well-read young women in her social circle. She could hold a conversation on Shakespeare, French literature, or political philosophy with the ease of someone twice her age, and she learned to keep her feelings to herself. She developed what people around her would describe for the rest of her life as an air of inscrutability, a kind of composed stillness that could read as coldness, but was really something closer to armor. When the world inside your own home is unstable, you learn to control what you can. You learn to show only what is safe to show. The one place she could relax that armor was next door. The Carow family happened to live near the Roosevelts, a gregarious, energetic, intensely alive family that seemed to operate on a completely different emotional frequency than her own. Theodore's mother, Mittie Roosevelt, took a liking to young Edith and invited her to be tutored alongside her own children. Edith and Corinne Roosevelt, who were the same age, became inseparable best friends. And Corinne's older brother, Theodore, loud, restless, already fascinated by everything from taxidermy to Shakespeare, became someone Edith gravitated toward naturally. They were alike in some ways that mattered. Both loved books. Both had a certain seriousness underneath the surface. But where Theodore wore everything on the outside, Edith kept it all in. By their teenage years, something had shifted between them. They were not quite friends, not quite more than that. Theodore reportedly called her the most cultivated and best-read girl he knew. There may have been a proposal somewhere in those years. Historians have long debated exactly what happened between them in 1877 and 1878. But something broke. The details are lost, deliberately so. And when Theodore left for Harvard in the fall of 1878, the connection between them quietly frayed. He met someone else at Harvard. Her name was Alice Hathaway Lee, and he fell for her completely. When he married Alice in 1880, Edith attended the wedding. She smiled. She gave a party for the couple. She was gracious about all of it, and she kept the rest to herself. The shadow of that time never entirely left her. Later in life, she burned the letters. She destroyed much of her father's correspondence. She erased what she could. But you do not spend a childhood in a house full of silent suffering without it shaping you. Edith Caro came out of that brownstone on Union Square as someone who understood, at a deep level, that life rarely gives you what you want, and that the only dignified response is to keep moving. What none of them could have predicted was just how soon she would be tested on that belief, and in the most devastating way possible. Segment 7. The Second Wife. In February 1884, Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt died. She was 22 years old, 2 days after giving birth to her daughter, also named Alice. On that same day, in the same house, Theodore's mother, Mittie, also died of typhoid fever. 2 women he loved, gone within hours of each other. Theodore Roosevelt, who had always used action to outrun grief, went to the Badlands of North Dakota and threw himself into ranching and hunting. He left his infant daughter, Alice, in the care of his older sister, and he did not speak about what had happened. Not in public, not in his diary, not for a long time. Edith and Theodore did not see each other for months after Alice's death, but in the fall of 1885, they crossed paths again at the home of Theodore's older sister, Anna. What followed was not a dramatic romance. It was quieter than that. More like 2 people who had always been circling back toward each other finally stopping. By November of 1885, they were engaged. It was kept a secret. Edith's mother had plans to move the family to Europe to economize. The Caro finances had never recovered from Charles's ruin, and there was no point in announcing anything before they had sorted out the practical details of their lives. They married on December 2nd, 1886, in London at St. George's, Hanover Square. It was a small ceremony, rainy and grey by most accounts. Theodore wore an orange lily in his buttonhole. Edith wore grey. From the outside, this might have looked like a story with a neat resolution. Childhood friends reunited, married at last. But Edith walked into that marriage with open eyes about what she was taking on. Theodore was not an easy man to be married to. He was brilliant, generous, physically tireless, and deeply loving, but also domineering, prone to going his own direction without much consultation, and deeply attached to the memory of his first wife in ways he almost never discussed out loud. Edith understood this. She was not naive, and she made a decision, early in their marriage, that would define everything that followed. She would be the center of gravity in this family. She would manage the money, the children, the household, the schedule, and when necessary, the husband. Theodore could be the force that moved outward into the world. She would be the force that held everything together at home. They moved into Sagamore Hill, the house on Long Island that Theodore had originally built with Alice Lee in mind. Edith renamed it, refurnished it, and made it her own. She also, quietly, took on the raising of Theodore's infant daughter, Alice, insisting that the child be brought home to live with them rather than continue to be raised by Theodore's sister. Historians have noted that this decision came partly from genuine care, but also partly from a desire to reduce the influence that Sister Anna held over her husband. Edith was a woman who understood the dynamics of a family, and she moved accordingly. Over the next decade, she gave birth to 5 more children. Theodore Jr. in 1887, Kermit in 1889, Ethel in 1891, Archibald in 1894, and Quentin in 1897. There were also at least one or two miscarriages in between. It is thought she suffered from depression following each birth, a fact noted by her own family, though never spoken of openly. She bore it all with the same composed silence she had practiced since childhood. Theodore was often away. The Civil Service Commission in Washington, then the New York City Police Commissionership, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy. His career moved fast, and it moved him around. Edith followed when she could, managed alone when she couldn't. She kept the accounts, wrote the letters, raised the children, and maintained Sagamore Hill as the one fixed point in a family that was always in motion. She also had an opinion about Theodore's career that she did not hesitate to express in private. When he was considering running for mayor of New York City in 1894, she pushed back firmly. She preferred Washington. She preferred the stability it offered. He did not run. When he went to Cuba in 1898 to fight in the Spanish-American War, she traveled to Tampa, Florida, just to see him off. When he came back under a military quarantine, she defied it to meet him at Montauk and help nurse veterans at the hospital nearby. She was not a woman who sat still and waited. She simply did not do it loudly. And then, in September 1901, everything changed again. Suddenly, dramatically, and without any preparation at all. Segment 6. The White House. Manager-in-Chief. President William McKinley was shot on September 6, 1901, at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. He died 8 days later. Theodore Roosevelt, who had been hiking in the Adirondacks when the news came, rushed to Buffalo and took the oath of office as the 26th President of the United States on September 14, 1901. He was 42 years old, the youngest man ever to hold that office. Edith got the news at Sagamore Hill. She had 6 children, a household to pack up, and almost no time to prepare for what was coming. The nation was in mourning. Theodore was now the most powerful man in America, and she was, without any warning or rehearsal, the First Lady of the United States. Her first official duty was to attend McKinley's funeral. She arrived at the White House, looked at her new home, rearranged the furniture in the family's private quarters, and then, by one account, slept for 2 days. That small detail says something true about Edith Roosevelt. She was not someone who hid from reality or who dramatized exhaustion. She simply recognized it, allowed herself a brief recovery, and then got up and went to work. The work was considerable. The White House in 1901 was not really adequate for a family with 6 children and the obligations of a modern presidency. Business meetings happened in the family's living quarters. There was no clear separation between the president's office and his private life. Children raced through hallways where foreign dignitaries were trying to wait. Edith, along with Theodore, secured congressional funding for a complete renovation of the building. They worked with the prestigious architectural firm McKim, Mead, and White to tear out a large staircase on the main floor, enlarge the state dining room, separate the family residence from the executive offices, and construct what is now known as the West Wing. They redesigned the interior with a clean, classical elegance that stood in sharp contrast to the heavy Victorian decor it replaced. It was Edith's project as much as Theodore's, and it was representative of the way she approached the role of First Lady, not as a ceremonial function, but as a management problem that needed solving. She also hired Isabella Hagner as the first federally salaried White House social secretary. This was not a minor innovation. Before Edith, the First Lady handled all her correspondence, all her social planning, all her public communications essentially alone. By creating the role of social secretary, Edith established a model that every First Lady after her would follow. She was building an institution, whether she called it that or not. The social calendar she ran was remarkable in scope. In the 1902 season alone, approximately 40,000 people visited the White House, more than any previous year. Edith organized weekly gatherings of the cabinet members' wives. She controlled who attended formal events. She curated the guest lists for the White House's many musicales, dinners, and garden parties with the precision of someone who understood that Washington's social world and Washington's political world were not, in fact, separate things. She also managed the press with a deliberate, modern-seeming strategy. She resented the intrusion of journalists into her family's life, but she understood that ignoring them entirely was not an option. Instead, she arranged for professional photographs of the family to be distributed to news organizations, giving them what they needed while maintaining control over the image. The press got their pictures, but they got the pictures she chose. She was equally precise about her own name. Even as First Lady, she refused to use the title. She signed everything as Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt, not First Lady, not Mrs. Roosevelt. She never used the shorthand. Whether that came from genuine modesty or from a desire to assert, quietly, that she remained her own person, even inside this very public role, it is hard to say. Probably both. There is one story that captures her in the White House years better than almost any other. She arranged, in the ground floor corridor, a gallery of portraits of all the First Ladies, including, she noted with dry humour, herself. She did not hang these portraits out of vanity. She hung them because she believed the White House was a piece of American history, and that the women who had lived in it deserved to be part of that record. It was an act of institutional thinking that was unusually far-sighted for its time. She was not just managing a household. She was shaping what the First Lady's office would look like for the next century. But underneath the social calendar and the renovation projects and the press management, Edith Roosevelt remained what she had always been, a private woman who found the demands of public life genuinely uncomfortable. She did not enjoy the Easter egg role on the White House lawn, which she found noisy and destructive to the grass. She did not use the title First Lady. She never campaigned alongside her husband. She stayed just outside the frame. And yet, every person who worked with her during those years noted that she was always there, always watching, always, in her quiet way, shaping what happened. Theodore himself admitted it plainly. He said that whenever he went against her judgment, he came to regret it. And in 1909, when he left the White House, when the presidency was over and the press corps and the cabinet wives and the 40,000 annual visitors were someone else's problem, Edith Roosevelt went home to Sagamore Hill and exhaled. She thought the hardest part was behind her. She was wrong. Segment 5. The Years of Losing. The first thing Theodore did after leaving the presidency was leave. He and their son, Kermit, departed for a year-long safari in Africa, funded by the Smithsonian Institution, just weeks after handing the White House over to William Taft. Edith stayed at Sagamore Hill. The older children had moved out or were away at school. The house was quiet in a way it had never been before. The solitude became too much after a few months. She packed up the younger children, Quentin, Archibald, and Ethel, and took them on a long tour through France, Switzerland, and Italy, where her sister Emily was living. She did not stay home and wait. She was not the kind of woman who did that. Theodore and Edith reunited in Egypt in March 1910, and together they made a tour of Europe before returning to New York in June. For the first time in almost 2 years, The whole family was in the same place at the same time. It would not last. Theodore, unable to stay still, threw himself back into public life. He challenged his hand-picked successor, William Taft, for the Republican presidential nomination in 1912, failed to win it, and then ran as a third-party candidate on the Progressive Party ticket. Edith was not enthusiastic about this. She understood that the math did not favor him, and she was right. He lost to Woodrow Wilson in November. During the campaign, he survived an assassination attempt in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, when a gunman shot him at close range before a speech. The bullet was slowed by the folded manuscript in his breast pocket and lodged in his chest. Theodore, remarkably, still delivered the speech before going to the hospital. Edith was terrified, but she said very little about it in public. The following year, 1913, Theodore announced that he was going to explore an uncharted river in Brazil, the Rio da Dúvida, or River of Doubt. Edith travelled with him and Kermit to South America as far as the starting point of the expedition, then returned to wait. What followed was one of the most dangerous journeys Theodore Roosevelt ever undertook. The jungle nearly killed him. He contracted malaria, developed a serious infection in his leg, and at one point told his companions to leave him behind, convinced that his death would be less of a burden than his continued survival. Kermit refused. He effectively carried his father out of the Amazon. Theodore came back alive, but he was never entirely well again. The jungle left permanent damage, recurring bouts of malaria, inflammation so severe it sometimes required hospitalization, and a physical fragility that sat oddly on a man who had always seemed indestructible. Then came the war. When America entered the First World War in 1917, all four of Edith and Theodore's sons enlisted. Theodore Jr., Kermit, Archibald, and Quentin all went to France. Archie was wounded badly enough that his arm was partially paralyzed. Kermit served first with the British in Mesopotamia, then transferred to the American forces. Theodore Jr. fought in the Meuse-Argonne, and Quentin, the youngest, the most light-hearted, the boy who had once smuggled his pony into the White House elevator, became a pilot in the Army Air Service. Quentin Roosevelt was shot down by German fighters over France on July 14, 1918. He was 20 years old. Edith had said, years earlier, that you cannot raise boys as eagles and then expect them to become sparrows. She had said it with pride. Now it came back to her like something she had never meant to mean. Theodore was shattered by Quentin's death. Those who saw him in the months that followed wrote that the old energy was gone, that the boy in him had died. He wrote to friends that he could not speak about Quentin without losing himself. In a letter to their son Kermit in October 1918, Edith wrote that Theodore carried the grief constantly, that she could see it in him every day, that he thought not of the happy memories, but of what Quentin might have become. She was carrying the same weight. She simply carried it differently. A family friend who came to visit in August 1918, a month after Quentin died, remembered that when Edith saw him in his military uniform, her eyes filled with tears and she turned away. Then she put her hand on his arm and told him she was all right. She was not all right, but she was composed. Those are not the same thing. Theodore Roosevelt died at Sagamore Hill on January 6, 1919, less than 6 months after Quentin. He died in his sleep, of a blood clot. He was 60 years old. Edith was 57. She stayed inside while the funeral took place outside the house, as was the custom for widows. She told only her sister-in-law Corinne something she would never say publicly, that she felt she had died with him. But she had children to care for, grandchildren on the way, a family that now needed her more, not less. So she did what she had always done. She got up. She went forward. And here is where Edith Roosevelt's story takes a turn that most people, even those who know her name, have never heard. Segment 4. The Wandering Widow. In the years after Theodore's death, something unexpected happened. Edith Roosevelt, who had spent her entire adult life organizing herself around other people's needs, discovered that she had wants of her own. She closed up Sagamore Hill and went to Europe. She visited Quentin's grave in Chamery, France, and had a fountain and a stone marker erected there, with an inscription taken from a Shelley poem. She sat with it for a while, in the way that people do when there is nothing left to say, and then she kept moving. She travelled. Not tentatively, not the way a grieving widow in 1919 was supposed to travel. Carefully, in the company of respectable companions, to respectable destinations. She went everywhere. Over the next 2 decades, she visited more than 30 countries. She took an around-the-world trip with her son Kermit and his wife Belle, during which they experienced an earthquake in Japan and crossed Russia on the Trans-Siberian Railway in the dead of winter. She went to South America and saw the Iguazu Falls. She traveled through Asia, Africa, Puerto Rico. She spent long stretches with her sister Emily in Italy. She called this period her Odyssey. In a private letter, she described the freedom of it. The sense, now that she was no longer someone's wife or someone's first lady, that she could finally follow what she called the Wanderfoot. The word was hers. It suggests something that had been there all along, held in check by the demands of her life. She also wrote. She co-authored a travel book called Cleared for Strange Ports, published in 1927, which blended her journeys with reflections on motherhood and family. She worked on a book about her ancestors. She was politically active. She stumped for Warren Harding in 1920, and in 1932, she appeared at Madison Square Garden to speak against her cousin by marriage, Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidential campaign, having made a point of her Republican loyalties her whole life. Over time, she grew to respect Franklin and his policies more than she initially expected to. But in 1932, she was still fighting. She was in her 70s doing most of this. She was a woman who had run the White House at 50, lost her husband and her youngest son within 6 months of each other, and then gone out to see the world. There is something remarkable about that, even if it is not a comfortable kind of remarkable. But the losses were not finished with her. In 1943, 24 years after Theodore's death, Edith Roosevelt lost Kermit. Segment 3. The Favorite Son. Of all her children, Kermit had always been the one closest to Edith's own nature. He was quieter than the others, more literary. He had her love of books, her facility for languages. He could read or speak Greek, French, Portuguese, Swahili, Arabic, Hindustani, Urdu, and several others. He was also, from early adulthood, prone to a deep inner darkness that he could not entirely explain or control. Kermit's life had been one of genuine adventure. He accompanied Theodore on the African safari in 1909. He was the person who kept his father alive on the River of Doubt expedition in Brazil in 1913. The one who refused to leave him behind, who carried him through fever and infection and near starvation, who emerged from the jungle changed in ways he never fully talked about. He served in 2 world wars, first with the British in Mesopotamia during the First World War, then again when the Second World War broke out. But alongside the adventures, the depression deepened. The Great Depression hit him financially. His business ventures collapsed. He began drinking heavily, the way his grandfather Charles Carow had drunk, the way his uncle Elliot Roosevelt, Theodore's younger brother, had drunk before losing himself entirely. It was a pattern Edith recognized. She had watched it destroy her father. Now she watched it take her son apart, piece by piece. By the early 1940s, Kermit was in serious trouble. He had been medically discharged from the British Army in 1941 due to his health. His wife Belle, who had long known the family's worries about Kermit, and his brother Archie, both reached out to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, their cousin, and asked him to find Kermit a military post in the American Army, believing that purpose and structure might help him regain his footing. Franklin agreed. Kermit was commissioned as a major in the U.S. Army and sent to Fort Richardson near Anchorage, Alaska, where he helped organize a territorial militia in preparation for any Japanese advance on the mainland. It did not help. He was medically discharged again in early 1943. His drinking had made it impossible for him to continue. He returned, briefly, and then the family learned he had disappeared again, this time with a woman who was not his wife. Belle asked that he be sent back to duty. By May 1943, he was back at Fort Richardson. On June 3rd, 1943, Kermit said goodbye to a friend. He went to his room, and he took his own life. He was 53 years old. The family, knowing what Edith's grief would be, knowing that he was her favorite, that she had perhaps never stopped worrying about him even in her best years, made a decision. They did not tell her what had happened. They told her that Kermit had died of a heart attack in his sleep. She was 81 years old. She believed them. Or perhaps she simply let herself believe them. It is impossible to know. Edith Roosevelt had spent her entire life knowing more than she let on. The real circumstances of Kermit's death would not become widely known for decades, long after she was gone. Segment 2. And then another. The year after Kermit's death, Edith lost Theodore Jr., her eldest, her firstborn son. Theodore Jr. had gone back into military service despite being in poor health by the time of World War II. He suffered from severe arthritis and a weakened heart, and the army was initially reluctant to accept him in a combat role. He insisted. He had spent his whole adult life measuring himself against the legend of his father, and the war was one of the few places left where that measuring still made sense. He was eventually appointed a brigadier general and assigned to the 4th Infantry Division. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, Theodore Jr. waded ashore on Utah Beach in Normandy, France, alongside his men. He was 56 years old, making him the oldest soldier in the initial assault wave and the only general officer to land by sea rather than by air. He walked the beach with a cane in one hand and a pistol in the other, and helped redirect the landing force when they came ashore in the wrong position. The men around him later described the calm certainty with which he moved. For his actions that day, he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. He died 5 weeks later, on July 12, 1944, of a heart attack. He was later buried in France alongside his brother Quentin in the Normandy American Cemetery, just as their parents had once said they would want. 2 sons in 2 years. Edith was 82 years old when she learned that Ted Jr. was gone. She had already buried her husband, her youngest son, and now her eldest. There is a particular kind of grief that accumulates past the point where it has any new shape left to take, where it simply becomes the condition you live inside rather than something that visits. Edith had arrived at that place. She had outlived most of the people who had made her life make sense. She spent the next few years at Sagamore Hill, moving more slowly through the rooms she had known in every season for 6 decades. Her health declined gradually. The great restlessness that had once carried her across Russia on a train in midwinter, that had pulled her to the Iguazu Falls and the streets of wartime Europe, had grown quiet at last. She read, as she always had. She wrote letters to family. She received her grandchildren and her surviving children, Ethel and Archibald. The house, which had once been full of noise and motion and the competing needs of 6 children and a president, was still now. Memory does that to a house, fills in the silence with the echo of everyone who once moved through it. On the tombstone she had chosen for herself, she had asked for one sentence, not an office held, not a name, not a date. She wanted it to read, "Everything she did was for the happiness of others." It is a line that sits quietly on the grave. It does not demand anything. It does not announce itself. It is, in its restraint and its precision, entirely like the woman who wrote it. Segment 1. The Last Years and What They Left Behind. By the mid-1940s, Edith Roosevelt was one of the oldest surviving figures from an America that most people alive at the time had only read about. She had stood on a Roosevelt family balcony at the age of 4 and watched Abraham Lincoln's funeral procession pass in the street below. She had slept 2 nights in the White House after her husband became president in the aftermath of an assassination. She had sent 4 sons to war. She had said goodbye to 2 of them forever. She spent the last year of her life largely bedridden. The woman who had once crossed Russia by train and navigated the social politics of Washington society was confined to Sagamore Hill, in the house she had lived in since 1886. She died on September 30th, 1948. She was 87 years old. She was buried next to Theodore at Young's Memorial Cemetery in Oyster Bay, New York. She had outlived him by nearly 30 years. She had, as she once told Corinne in the raw days after his death, felt herself to have died with him. And yet, she had kept living and travelling and writing and watching her children and grandchildren find their way in a world she had done so much to help shape for them. The things she built are still there. The portraits of the First Ladies hang in the White House corridor where she ordered them placed. The West Wing still holds the President's offices. Every First Lady since her has had a social secretary. She made these things happen without fanfare, without a title she ever used, and without leaving her name on any of it. That was entirely intentional. She understood the difference between doing something and being seen to do it, and she had long since chosen the former. Historians eventually found her. They ranked her consistently among the most capable people ever to hold the role, called her the first truly modern First Lady, credited her with building the office into what it became. She would have found the attention faintly annoying. But the ranking and the adjectives are not what stays with you. What stays with you is the quiet, the composure that was never coldness, but was something harder to define. A discipline born from a childhood spent in a house where nothing was stable, refined over decades of managing a household, a public role, and a husband who was, by any measure, one of the most demanding men in American history. She had said, once, about her sons going to war, "You cannot raise boys as eagles and expect them to become sparrows." She had meant it with pride. She paid for it with grief that she never stopped carrying, even when she stopped showing it. There is something particular about a woman who controls everything, who is praised, specifically, for her control, and then quietly falls apart on the inside in a way that nobody around her is quite equipped to see. Not because she is hiding, but because she has simply gotten very, very good at looking like she is fine. She destroyed the love letters Theodore had written her over decades. She burned her father's correspondence. She curated what remained. She was a woman who understood that privacy, for someone in her position, was not a luxury. It was the only territory that was entirely her own. In the end, what she left behind was not a diary or a memoir or a detailed record of her inner life. She left behind a house on Long Island, 6 children she had raised with relentless attention, an institution she had helped to build, a gallery of portraits that said women belonged in the historical record, and a single sentence on a stone in Oyster Bay. Everything she did was for the happiness of others. Whether that was a statement of satisfaction or of sacrifice, or both, in the way that most true things are both, is something only she ever knew. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.